We're living in an interesting time, from our country's perspective anyway. The winds of change have really been blowing for quite a long time, at least half a century. These things, as they call them, the winds of change. But now, those winds seem to have become more like waves, and maybe even one giant wave, a tsunami of change, a cultural tsunami. And I believe these changes have caused somewhat of a panic, or at the very least a sense of hopelessness among many Christians. Doom, a sense of doom. What is the world coming to? We might think. You turn on the news, look at social media. What is happening? What's happening to the world? What's it coming to? How can we possibly prevail in such times? What's the point in trying to preach the gospel, for instance, in this cultural and political climate? You may have found yourself asking those questions or wondering things similar to those, and they're not altogether unreasonable thoughts, for Americans anyway. And the reason is because what we're witnessing as a young country is something that we, as a country, have never experienced before. It's not the world that's changing, per se. The world's always been the way that it is. But we're seeing things change. And it fills us with a sense of dread and doom that everything is hopeless. It's all hopeless. It's all falling apart. And so we're watching the world crumble before our very eyes, it seems. It feels for some of us. But this is actually not the case. It's not actually the case. The thing is, though, simply hearing somebody say that it's not the case, or even knowing that it's not the case, doesn't necessarily make it any better as far as our mindset and our perception of things. So how do we defeat the overwhelming sense of doom and crippling self-defeat in a culture that is changing so drastically, like ours is changing? Let me go ahead and give you a disclaimer that with such things as this, and with many things, there's no secret. There's no key. And sometimes that can be discouraging. There's no secret formula to solve many problems. I'm having this struggle or this problem, whether you're wanting to learn something or learn to play an instrument or learn to do something, and I'm stuck on this, and I don't know how to get beyond this, and we get in our heads that they're out there somewhere is the secret somewhere. On the internet somewhere, I just got to find it. Some people aren't telling me the secret, and I know it's just one thing, and all I need to do is know that one thing, and then everything is solved. Sadly, that's not the way things work, and that's not we're going to see now. That I don't have some secret magic key to how to survive, or much less thrive in a cultural revolution. But we can, sometimes there are some things, some facts that we forget, that if we are reminded of those things, it helps us to change our mindset. And this morning, we're just going to take a few minutes to look at just three things that we can remember, or that we should remember, that will help us maybe get back in a right frame of mind and understand that it's not all doomed as we might think it is. Just some things, three things. Number one, the culture in which Christianity was born was actually not that drastically different than from the culture that we are increasingly finding ourselves today. Let me repeat that. It's not going to be up here, so sorry. Doing a little different. The culture in which Christianity was born was not actually all that different from the culture from our culture today. So when we look at our culture and think things have changed so much, the gospel has no power here, we have to remember that's not true. Because the culture in which Christianity was born, the gospel was born, so to speak, was just as messed up as ours seems to be becoming. The Roman Empire, in the days of the first century, when the church was established, when Christianity was born, here are some things that characterized it. Rampant sexual immorality. See if any of these sound familiar. Okay? Rampant sexual immorality. A general low value of life, human life. The debasement of women. Frequent divorce. High suicide rates. And then you pair with all these the fierce anti-Christian persecution that existed under Roman rule at that time. You see, it wasn't all lovely and everything just peachy back then. And in fact, you could say, and rightly so, they had as many, if not more, obstacles than we do today in their culture. So how did they survive? How'd they survive? They didn't just survive, they thrived during that cultural and moral tsunami that they were living in. And by the way, Paul indicated that Christ came and the gospel began, Christianity began at the perfect time. Galatians 4:4. When the time was come, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son. How was it the perfect time if that's what the culture looked like? Well, we could probably discuss that for a long, long time. But just make note of the fact that that's what it was like, spiritually and morally, and yet, at the same time, it was the perfect time for it to begin. But how did they survive? Well, you can look at Acts 2 and see how they survived. Here's some patterns we see from Acts 2. There was personal responsibility, emphasizing personal responsibility. It's about you, and you, and you, and you. Personal responsibility, Acts 2, verse 40. Save yourselves from this crooked generation. Verse 41, receiving and obeying the gospel. Verse 42, continuing and fellowshipping and worshiping and praying. Daily personal religion, verses 44 through 46. Sharing with each other. And evangelizing. We saw that last week in our series of fundamentals. Evangelizing. This is how they survived during that time. And they, like I said, they didn't just survive, they thrived. Alan Webster said in one of this year's editions of Spiritual Sword, he said this: historically, having freedom to evangelize, worship, and live in peace is the exception. It's not the rule, it's the exception. And he goes on to acknowledge that few generations have had it as easy as Christians in America the last quarter millennium or so. We have had it easy. Why does it seem like everything's falling apart? Because we had it so easy so far. But just because it's becoming not so easy, not as easy, doesn't mean we should lose hope. We have to remember their culture, Paul's culture, for instance, where he was going around preaching the gospel, establishing congregations, winning souls, was just as morally bankrupt as our own, if not more so. Number two, thing to remember: the gospel was and is intended for the entire world, which is full of all different kinds of cultures. The gospel was intended to be preached to the entire world. Even at that time, there were many different cultures in the world. Rome was a big empire. But if you look at how big the Roman Empire was on an actual globe of the earth, or map of the whole earth, it wasn't so big. But there were plenty of cultures all around. God didn't create a plan that was going to be limited by or restricted to one particular culture. But from the very beginning, the gospel was intended to be preached over the whole creation. That's what Jesus said, Matthew 16:15. And even at the time when Jesus gave that commission, during the vast Roman Empire, many different cultures in the world at large, And so as the centuries have progressed, and this has become even more evident that we have so many different cultures, we shouldn't be dismayed or discouraged, because it was all built into God's intentions and plans from the start. Colossians 1, verses 5 and 6, Paul said, "Of this you have heard before in the word of the truth, the gospel which has come to you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing." The whole world, the gospel is bearing fruit and increasing, as it also does among you, since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. Romans 15, Paul planned to go to Spain. Now, we don't know if he ever made it to Spain. And apologies for not having a map to show you. But Spain was by far the farthest Paul would have ever traveled as far as the New Testament record is concerned. It was on the very far western edge of the Roman domain at that time. And while it was part of the Roman domain, surely there were many cultural differences between there and the far eastern side of the Roman Empire, where most of the Bible lands are located. But you know what? All of that is really irrelevant to Paul. Cultural distinction was irrelevant to Paul. He didn't care. It made no difference. Well, I don't know if I should go there because their culture is different than what I'm used to. Nope. Didn't even consider it. Is Spain on the earth? Yes. I'm going to Spain to preach. Simple as that. Simple as that. The gospel is for all people, all places, all times. Jude 3, it was delivered once for all. All places, all people, all times. And that means it was meant for a variety of vastly different cultures. So as our culture seems to evolve from what it was in the 1950s compared to what it is today, that's no different than a culture on this side of the earth compared to a culture on the other side of the earth. Does it mean that there's no hope for the gospel in that different culture? No. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't really mean anything. Everywhere Paul went, he had some level of success. And whether it was zero or whether it was tons of success, great amount, didn't matter, because the gospel was meant to be preached everywhere, not dependent upon any certain kind of culture. Which leads us to number 3. The mission of the church is always the same. Sort of branching off of that. The mission of the church is always the same despite any other factor. This is perhaps the most underrated blessing in Christ. We take it for granted. We may not even think about it. That the mission of the church always is the same. The simple blessing of knowing that our mission, our goal, and our objective is always the same. This means the only thing we may have to change is perhaps the manner in which we pursue that goal. Just little tweaks maybe. We don't have to worry about changing the whole game plan, the whole mission. We don't have to get caught up on or panicked about cultural swings and trends and these tsunamis of change. Our mission is always the same. And that is to preach the gospel. In fact, it's twofold, we might say. We never have to worry about coming up with an entirely new game plan because we have the blessing and peace of knowing that there's only one. And it sort of has a subjective side and an objective side. And I say those with much reservation because I don't even know if either one of them is subjective. But if it is, there's, first of all, the sharing of our faith. 1 Thessalonians 1:8, Paul talked about how your faith is made known throughout the whole world. So the Thessalonians were sharing what we might call their faith. But then there's the objective side of it, of sharing the faith. That's our mission. That's our goal. It's never changed, ever. From the beginning to today and all the way to the day when Jesus returns. It's the same. Jesus didn't say anything. The apostles said nothing about, now pray that your culture never changes, because the gospel will be a lot less effective then. Nope. I'll tell you what it did say, in a culture that was, again, as morally depraved as any culture could be. Paul said the gospel is the power of salvation to everyone who believes. Simple as that. The gospel is just as powerful today, and our mission is just the same. So, what can we, if you could sum it up, I think Paul summed it up in 1 Timothy 4, verse 2. When he told Timothy, preach the word. Be ready. Note, get this part. In season. Bet you can guess the rest. I hope you can, if you're awake. And out of season. Be ready in season, out of season. You know when something is in season? Well, then you know what it means when something's out of season. Be ready at opportune times. Be ready at inopportune times. Be ready in receptive cultures. Be ready in unreceptive cultures. Just be ready. Preach the word. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. That's it. That's the goal. So as we look around, instead of getting dismayed and thinking, things have changed so much, nobody's going to believe. Nobody wants the gospel. We can go back even before the first century and see that there were plenty of people that didn't want the truth then either. The world has not changed. Our country is changing. There's no doubt about that. But again, what we have had as far as our culture, that was the exception. All we're doing, and it's unfortunate as it is, we're sort of reverting back to the rule of the world. But the gospel was just as powerful, and in one way, more powerful in those cultures that were more different, more contrary to the standard of the gospel, is when we see it thriving. So our goal is the same. The question for us is, are we doing that? Is that what we're doing? Are we ready? At least be ready. Don't just be ready, but at least be ready. To whether it's in season or out of season, be ready, because our goal is still to preach the gospel. Whether the culture is thirsting and hungering for it, or whether they're like the people in Jeremiah's day and they want to throw you in a well and leave you there to die. Goal is the same. The gospel is to be proclaimed and the faith spread. This morning, if you maybe need to make changes, maybe you haven't been so ready. Maybe you haven't been preaching. Maybe you've been overcome with dismay and doom and feel like, why waste my breath and my energy? Because take a look around. Just remember these things, as simple and inadequate as they may be. Don't doubt the power of God. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. But, as Paul said, how will people believe if they've never heard? How will they hear unless somebody's going and preaching to them? Well, that's where we come in. And that's what we need to do, even if it's in small baby steps as we live our lives each and every day.